I want you to try something with me for a second. Think about the last English test you took, or the last time you read an English article and understood almost every single word. Now think about the last time you tried to have a real conversation in English, and your mind went blank over a word you have honestly known for years. Here is the strange truth nobody tells you. Those two moments did not happen because your English is different in each situation. They happened because your English is exactly the same, but your access to it is not. You are not missing knowledge, you are missing a skill, and those are two completely different problems with two completely different solutions. Most learners spend years chasing the wrong fix. They think, if I just learn more words, if I just study one more grammar chapter, if I just watch one more show, eventually speaking will click into place on its own. And then months pass, sometimes years pass, the vocabulary keeps growing, the grammar keeps sharpening, and the speaking still feels exactly as stuck as before. If this sounds familiar, I need you to hear this clearly, right at the start. You do not have an English problem. You have a speaking problem, and it is entirely fixable, starting today. My name is Maya, and this is the Speaking Momentum, the channel built around one single idea that most learners already have enough English sitting inside them to hold real conversations. They just were never shown how to actually use it under pressure, in real time, with a real person waiting for an answer. Today, I'm going to show you exactly why this gap exists, and exactly how to close it. I want to share something personal before we go further, because I think it matters. I have talked with thousands of learners over the years through this channel, and one pattern shows up again and again, almost without exception. The learners who feel the most frustrated, the most discouraged, are very often not beginners. They are intermediate and advanced learners, people who have already invested years, sometimes a decade or more, into serious study. They have read novels in English, they can follow fast-paced podcasts, they can write clear, well-structured emails, and yet in a live conversation they still feel like a nervous beginner hunting for words that they know. If that description feels uncomfortably close to your own experience, I want you to really hear this. That frustration is not a sign that something is wrong with you, or your ability to learn languages. It is a sign that your training has been lopsided, extremely strong on one specific skill, comprehension, and comparatively undertrained on a different, related but distinct skill, real-time spoken production. This video exists to correct that imbalance directly, with a clear explanation of why it happened, and a concrete plan for fixing it, starting today. Before we dive in, if you have ever felt embarrassed freezing on a word you clearly know, hit subscribe, because that feeling is exactly what this whole channel exists to fix. Alright, let's get into it. Chapter 1. The Myth of Not Enough English. Let's start by taking apart a belief that is quietly ruining confidence for millions of learners around the world. The belief that struggling to speak means you simply do not know enough English yet. Here is a simple test that breaks this belief apart immediately. Think of 5 words in English you completely understand when you read or hear them. Words you would never need a dictionary for. Got them in your mind? Good. Now, honestly ask yourself, in the last week, how many of those 5 words actually came out of your own mouth in a real sentence, in a real conversation? For most learners, the honest answer is somewhere between 0 and 1. Sometimes 0 out of all 5, even though every single one of those words is fully, completely known. This gap has a name in language science, the difference between receptive knowledge and productive knowledge. Receptive knowledge is everything you can recognize and understand when it comes at you, through reading, through listening, through subtitles. Productive knowledge is the much smaller slice of that same knowledge that you can actually generate yourself, on demand, under time pressure, without any text in front of you to recognize. For virtually every language learner on Earth, receptive knowledge is dramatically larger than productive knowledge, and this is completely normal. It happens in every language, for every person, including native speakers learning new vocabulary in their own first language. The same gap shows up constantly in native speakers too, which is a helpful reminder that it is not some special flaw unique to second language learners. Think of a native English speaker who reads widely and encounters plenty of sophisticated, formal vocabulary through books and articles, words they understand perfectly the moment they see them. Ask that same person to use several of those same sophisticated words spontaneously in casual conversation, and many of them will hesitate, reach for a simpler alternative, or avoid the word entirely, not because they do not know it, but because they have never actually practiced producing it out loud, under real conversational conditions. The receptive-productive gap is simply a universal feature of how human language ability works, not a personal weakness specific to you or to second language learners in general. So here is the reframe I want you to sit with for the rest of this video. Your struggle to speak is not evidence of a knowledge gap, it is evidence of an access gap, a gap between what is sitting quietly in your memory and what your brain can currently pull out under pressure. And access, unlike raw knowledge, is a trainable skill built through a very specific kind of practice, not through adding more words to an already overflowing vocabulary list. I want to give you a bit of encouragement here, because I know how discouraging this cycle feels. If you have ever thought, maybe I am just not smart enough for this, maybe some people are naturally better at languages than me, I want you to let that thought go completely. The learners who speak confidently are not smarter, and they usually do not know more words than you. They simply spent time training access, actively pulling words out through speech, while you are likely spending almost all your time building recognition, taking words in through reading and listening. Same raw material, completely different training, completely different result. Once you accept this reframe, something powerful happens. The entire problem becomes far less overwhelming. You are not staring at a massive mountain of missing knowledge you need to somehow climb. You are looking at a specific, narrow, trainable skill gap, and narrow, specific gaps are exactly the kind of problem that responds fast to the right, targeted practice. That is what the rest of this video is going to give you. Let me give you a comparison that tends to make this idea click for a lot of learners. Think about a musician who has spent years studying music theory, reading about scales, chords, and composition, but has barely touched an actual instrument. That person could, in principle, describe in great technical detail what needs to happen to play a certain piece of music, but sit them down at a piano, and their hands will not automatically know what to do, not because they lack musical knowledge, but because knowledge and physical, real-time execution are simply different systems in the brain, trained through different kinds of practice. Speaking English works exactly the same way. Your knowledge is the music theory. Speaking practice is actually sitting at the instrument and playing, repeatedly, until your hands, or in this case your mouth, know what to do without conscious searching. This distinction also explains why some learners who technically know less vocabulary than you might still sound noticeably more confident and fluent in conversation. It is rarely because their underlying knowledge is larger. It is almost always because they have spent more actual time producing spoken language, out loud, under real or simulated pressure, building that retrieval speed that pure study, no matter how thorough, simply does not build on its own. Chapter 2. The Performance Gap, Knowledge versus Access. Let's go a little deeper into this idea, because understanding it clearly changes how you approach every single study session from this point forward. Picture your English knowledge as a massive library, thousands of books, carefully organized, filled with everything you have learned over the years. Now picture speaking as trying to find one specific book, pull it off the shelf, open it to the right page, and read a sentence out loud, all within about 2 seconds, while someone is standing in front of you, waiting. If your library is enormous but disorganized, if you have never practiced actually retrieving books quickly under a time limit, that search is going to take far longer than 2 seconds, no matter how many books you own. This is exactly what is happening inside your brain during a real conversation. The vocabulary is there, stored on the shelf. The grammar rule is there. But retrieval speed, the ability to grab exactly what you need and produce it almost instantly, is a completely separate skill from simply owning the knowledge in the first place. Most traditional English study, reading, watching, memorizing lists, builds the library. It rarely, if ever, builds retrieval speed. Let's push this library comparison a little further because it holds up remarkably well. Imagine 2 identical libraries, same books, same total collection, same physical size. In the first library, there is a librarian who has spent years practicing quickly locating any requested book, someone who can walk directly to the right shelf and hand you exactly what you need within seconds. In the second library, there is no trained librarian at all, just the books sitting there, technically available, but nobody practiced at finding them quickly. Ask for a specific book in each library, and the difference in response time will be dramatic, despite both libraries containing the exact same underlying collection. Your speaking brain needs a trained librarian, not simply a bigger collection of books, and that trained librarian is built exclusively through repeated active retrieval practice, not through continuing to add more books to an already sufficient collection. Here's something that might genuinely surprise you. Retrieval speed is trained almost entirely through one specific type of practice: repeated, timed, spoken production. Every time you successfully pull a word or phrase out of your memory and say it out loud, under some kind of mild time pressure, that retrieval pathway gets faster and stronger. Do this enough times with a specific word or phrase, and eventually it stops feeling like a search at all. It simply arrives, instantly, the moment you need it, the same way your own name arrives instantly when someone asks you what it is. This also explains a pattern that confuses a lot of learners: why certain words feel instantly available, while other, equally well-known words feel completely stuck. It usually is not about how well you know the word's meaning. It is about how many times you have actually retrieved and spoken that specific word before, under pressure. Words you have spoken often, even simple ones, come out instantly. Words you have only ever read or heard, even sophisticated, impressive ones, stay stuck, because that specific retrieval pathway has simply never been built, no matter how many times your eyes have passed over that word on a page. This reframes the entire goal of your practice time. Instead of asking, how many new words can I learn this week, a far more useful question becomes, how many words that I already know can I actually practice retrieving and speaking out loud this week? That single shift in focus, from acquisition to retrieval, from input to output, is often the single biggest lever available for closing your speaking gap quickly, and it is exactly what the rest of this video is built around. I also want to mention a related concept that helps explain why retrieval training feels so different from ordinary studying, something researchers call the testing effect. Studies on memory consistently find that actively trying to recall information, even when that attempt is difficult or partially unsuccessful, strengthens memory far more effectively than simply reviewing or rereading the same information passively. In other words, the mental effort of searching for a word, even when it takes a moment, even when you sometimes fail to find it, is not wasted struggle. It is actually the exact mechanism that builds stronger, faster retrieval pathways for next time. This means something important for how you should feel about those uncomfortable moments during practice, when a word feels stuck or slow to arrive. Rather than treating that struggle as evidence that something is wrong, or as a frustrating obstacle to avoid, I want you to start seeing it as the actual workout itself, the mental equivalent of the last few difficult repetitions in a physical workout that build real strength precisely because they are difficult. Easy, effortless recall does very little to build new retrieval speed. Slightly effortful, slightly uncomfortable recall, repeated consistently, is exactly what does. Chapter 3. Why more studying won't fix this. I need to say something directly, because I think a lot of learners need to hear it plainly. If your goal is specifically to speak more confidently, adding more study time to your current routine, more grammar, more vocabulary lists, more passive watching, is very likely not going to solve the problem, no matter how much extra time or effort you pour into it. This might sound almost backwards, so let me explain exactly why. Studying more vocabulary increases the size of your library. It does not, by itself, train the specific skill of grabbing a book off that shelf quickly under pressure. If retrieval speed is your actual bottleneck, and for most intermediate to advanced learners struggling specifically with speaking, it usually is, then pouring more effort into growing an already large library does very little to fix the actual bottleneck. You end up with an even bigger library and the exact same slow, effortful retrieval process you started with. Think about this using a completely different skill for a moment. Typing. Imagine someone who has read extensively about keyboard layouts, finger positioning theory, and typing techniques, but has almost never actually practiced typing on a real keyboard. Reading more books about typing theory will not make their fingers move faster. Only actual, repeated typing practice, fingers on real keys, builds that specific physical speed and automaticity. Vocabulary and grammar knowledge is the typing theory. Actual spoken practice is the fingers on the keyboard. You cannot substitute one for the other, no matter how much time you invest in the wrong one. I want to be careful here, because I'm not saying stop learning new vocabulary entirely. That would be an overcorrection in the wrong direction. New words absolutely still matter, especially as you reach more advanced levels and need more precise, specific language for particular situations. What I am saying is this: if speaking confidence is your current, specific goal, the ratio of your practice time needs to shift dramatically toward active, spoken retrieval practice, and away from passive absorption of new material, at least for a focused period of time, until that speaking gap genuinely closes. I want to reassure you clearly on this point, because it is easy to misread this advice as anti-vocabulary or anti-study in some broad general sense. That is not the message here at all. Vocabulary study, grammar study, reading, listening, all of these remain genuinely valuable parts of a well-rounded English learning journey over the long term. The specific point of this chapter is narrower and more targeted than that, simply that if the particular problem you are trying to solve right now is speaking hesitation and freezing, the particular fix for that particular problem is active output practice, not simply more input, because input and output, while both valuable, address genuinely different parts of overall language ability. Here's a practical way to think about this shift. If your current study routine is roughly 90% passive absorption, reading, watching, listening, and 10% active speaking practice, and you are frustrated specifically about speaking, that ratio needs to flip, at least temporarily, closer to 70% active speaking practice and 30% passive absorption. This does not mean abandoning input entirely. Input still matters for building overall language sense and exposing you to new patterns. But if speaking is your specific, named goal, your practice time needs to specifically, deliberately target that skill, the same way someone training for a marathon needs to actually run, not just read about running, no matter how much they already understand about proper running form from books and videos. I want to address a concern that often comes up when I share this idea: the worry that reducing input time might somehow cause existing knowledge to fade or weaken over time. This concern is understandable, but in practice it rarely plays out that way, especially for anyone who has already reached an intermediate level or beyond. Knowledge you have genuinely absorbed over months or years of prior study tends to remain reasonably stable, even with reduced additional input, particularly because your daily life likely still involves plenty of incidental English exposure anyway, through work, entertainment, or simply existing in a world where English content is everywhere. The temporary shift toward heavier output practice is not asking you to abandon input completely. It is asking you to rebalance your practice time deliberately for a period, specifically to address the one skill that has been consistently undertrained relative to everything else. There is also a practical, encouraging side effect worth mentioning here. Many learners who make this shift toward heavier output practice actually find that their comprehension continues improving anyway, sometimes even faster than before, because active production forces a much deeper, more engaged kind of processing than passive listening or reading typically requires. When you actively try to produce a sentence about a topic, you are engaging with the underlying grammar and vocabulary far more thoroughly than when you simply recognize that same content passing by in a video or article. Output practice, in other words, often quietly strengthens input skills as a natural side benefit, even though that was never its primary goal. Chapter 4. The freeze point. What happens when you try to speak? Let's get specific about that frozen blank feeling, because understanding exactly what happens in that moment gives us a much clearer target to train against. Someone asks you a question. For a split second, everything seems fine. You understood the question perfectly. Then, right as you try to respond, something strange happens. Your mind goes completely blank, even on words and grammar you actually know. This is what I call the freeze point, and it is one of the most common, most frustrating experiences learners describe to me. Here is what is actually happening during that freeze, broken down into what is really a very fast, layered process. First, your brain receives and processes the question, drawing on comprehension skills that are usually quite strong. Second, your brain begins searching for a response, scanning through vocabulary, grammar structures, and appropriate phrasing simultaneously. Third, and this is the critical part, if that search process has never been trained for speed, it can take several seconds, sometimes even longer under stress, to complete. Fourth, while all of this searching is happening, your awareness of the silence, the awkward pause, the other person waiting, triggers a stress response, and that stress response actively makes the search even slower and harder, creating a frustrating loop where anxiety about the pause makes the pause even longer. I want to normalize something here, because a lot of learners feel almost ashamed of this specific freeze, as if it reveals some kind of personal weakness. It genuinely does not. This exact freeze pattern shows up across an enormous range of learners, from complete beginners all the way through to quite advanced speakers who simply have not yet trained real-time retrieval under pressure. Even people who are highly articulate, highly intelligent, and deeply knowledgeable about English grammar and vocabulary can experience this exact freeze because it has almost nothing to do with overall intelligence or overall language knowledge, and almost everything to do with this one specific, narrow, trainable skill of fast retrieval under time pressure. This is not a sign of weak English ability. I want to be very clear about that. This is simply an untrained retrieval process meeting real-time pressure, combined with a completely natural stress reaction to that pressure. Both parts of this loop, slow retrieval and stress amplification, respond extremely well to targeted training, and we are going to address both directly. For the retrieval speed piece, the fix is exactly what we discussed in the last two chapters: repeated, active, spoken practice that specifically trains fast retrieval of words and phrases you already know, rather than continuing to add new material to an already large but slow-to-access library. For the stress amplification piece, the fix involves deliberately practicing under mild, controlled pressure in low-stakes situations, so your nervous system slowly learns that a pause, a hesitation, even a small mistake is not actually dangerous. This might mean setting a gentle timer while practicing sentences out loud, giving yourself just a few seconds to respond to a random question, simulating that real-time pressure in a safe, private setting where nothing bad actually happens if you pause or stumble. Over repeated practice sessions like this, your brain begins to associate that time pressure with safety and familiarity, rather than danger, and the stress amplification loop naturally begins to weaken. I want to explain a bit more about why this specific kind of controlled pressure practice works so well, because it draws on a well-established principle from how the brain handles anxiety more generally. When we avoid a feared situation entirely, the fear tends to stay exactly the same, or sometimes even grow stronger over time, because the brain never gets the chance to learn, through direct experience, that the feared outcome is not actually as dangerous as it feels. When we instead approach that same feared situation gradually, in small, manageable doses, repeatedly, the brain slowly gathers real evidence that contradicts the fear, and the anxious response naturally decreases over repeated exposures. This is exactly the same underlying mechanism that helps people overcome many different kinds of anxiety, and it applies just as directly to speaking anxiety as it does to anything else. This is also exactly why practicing entirely alone, in complete silence, without ever introducing any time pressure or performance element at all, often fails to meaningfully reduce real conversational anxiety, even after a lot of practice. If your practice never includes any element of pressure or unpredictability, your nervous system never actually gets the chance to learn that pressure is survivable. The speed rounds and timed exercises covered throughout this video are specifically designed to introduce that pressure element in a safe, controlled, private way, precisely so your brain can build genuine tolerance and comfort with it, before you need that same tolerance in a higher stakes real conversation. Chapter 5: Passive vocabulary versus active vocabulary. I want to give you a very practical, very specific tool in this chapter, a way to actually see, in concrete terms, exactly how big your access gap really is, because seeing it clearly makes it much easier to close. Here is a simple exercise. Take out a piece of paper or open a notes app and set a timer for 2 minutes. During those 2 minutes, write down from memory as many English words as you can that relate to a specific topic, let's say your job or your daily routine. Just write quickly, do not overthink it, do not use a dictionary or translator, just pure memory recall. When the timer ends, count how many words you wrote. Before you actually try this, let me set your expectations honestly, because the first attempt often feels harder and produces fewer words than people initially expect, and that is completely fine. It is exactly the point. Many learners are genuinely surprised, sometimes even a little unsettled, at how few words come out in that first timed attempt, especially compared to how effortlessly they could recognize far more related words if they were simply reading a list. That gap between the small number you can generate under time pressure and the much larger number you would instantly recognize is not a discouraging result. It is valuable, precise information about exactly where your practice energy needs to go next. Now, here is the revealing part. Go back through some content you have recently read or watched related to that same topic, an article, a video transcript, anything relevant, and count how many additional words related to that topic you clearly recognized and understood while reading or watching, words you did not write down during your 2-minute active recall exercise. For almost every learner who tries this, the second number, the recognized but not actively recalled number, is dramatically larger than the first number, sometimes 3 or 4 times larger, sometimes even more. That difference between those two numbers is your access gap, made completely visible and concrete, rather than just a vague, frustrating feeling. And here's the encouraging part. This gap is not permanent or fixed. It shrinks specifically and measurably through active recall practice, the exact type of exercise you just did with the timer. I want you to actually turn this exercise into a regular practice, not just a one-time diagnostic. Once or twice a week, pick a topic relevant to your life, work, family, hobbies, travel, whatever matters to you, and spend 2 focused minutes doing timed active recall, writing or, even better, speaking out loud as many related words and phrases as you can remember, purely from memory, no references allowed during the exercise. Afterward, look up 2 or 3 additional useful words for that topic that you missed, and specifically practice using those in spoken sentences, using the pattern method we will cover more in the next chapter. Over weeks of doing this consistently, something measurable and genuinely motivating happens. Your active recall numbers for each topic steadily climb, and more importantly, that same growing fluency starts showing up in real conversations, because you have been specifically, deliberately training the exact skill that real conversations actually require: fast, active retrieval, not passive recognition. I want to share a small but meaningful variation of this exercise for learners who find writing during the recall exercise a little too slow or a little too different from actual speaking. Instead of writing words down during your timed recall session, try speaking them out loud instead, into your phone's voice recorder, or simply out into the room, listing everything you can recall about the chosen topic, out loud, for the full 2 minutes. This spoken version of the exercise trains something even closer to the actual skill you are trying to build, because writing and speaking, despite both counting as production, still engage somewhat different processes, and speaking practice specifically strengthens exactly the pathway you need for real conversation. It also helps to occasionally revisit the same topic more than once, spaced a week or 2 apart, and compare your recall performance across those sessions. Many learners find this particular comparison deeply motivating because it offers concrete, measurable proof of progress on a topic they have specifically trained, proof that goes well beyond a vague, subjective feeling of getting better. Seeing your active recall list for, say, your job or your hobbies grow noticeably longer and come out more quickly after 2 or 3 weeks of related practice provides exactly the kind of tangible evidence that keeps motivation strong through the sometimes slow, gradual process of building real speaking fluency. Chapter 6, The 20% Rule, You do not need more words. Here is a number that might genuinely surprise you, and I want you to really sit with it, because it changes how urgent new vocabulary study should actually feel in your daily routine. Research into everyday conversational English consistently shows that a relatively small set of core, high-frequency words and phrases makes up the overwhelming majority of what people actually say in normal, everyday conversation. Rare, sophisticated, impressive vocabulary certainly exists and has its place, but it makes up a surprisingly small percentage of typical daily speech, even among highly educated native speakers. Most real conversations about work, family, weekend plans, opinions, feelings run almost entirely on a core set of everyday words and flexible, reusable patterns, not obscure vocabulary. Here is why this matters enormously for you right now. If you already have a reasonably solid intermediate vocabulary, and many of you watching this absolutely do, you almost certainly already possess more than enough raw vocabulary to handle the overwhelming majority of everyday conversations. Your speaking struggle is very unlikely to be caused by a genuine lack of available words. It is caused by that access gap we have been discussing, the inability to quickly retrieve and deploy the words you already have, combined perhaps with a lack of comfortable, flexible patterns for combining those words smoothly and naturally. To make this more concrete, think honestly about the kinds of conversations that make up most of your actual social and professional life: greeting someone, describing your day, giving a simple opinion, making plans, discussing a minor problem and how you handled it, catching up with a friend or colleague. Almost none of these extremely common, extremely frequent conversation types require rare, sophisticated vocabulary. They require a relatively small, flexible set of everyday words and patterns, used quickly and confidently. If you can genuinely, honestly say you already understand words like these when reading or listening, the missing piece is not more words, it is faster, more confident access to the ones already sitting quietly inside you. This means something quite freeing, if you let it sink in properly. You likely do not need to chase more vocabulary right now, nearly as urgently as you might currently feel you do. What you actually need is deep, repeated, active practice with the core vocabulary and patterns you already possess, until using them becomes fast and automatic, rather than slow and effortful. Chasing new rare words, while your existing core vocabulary remains slow and hard to access, is a little like buying more furniture for a house whose front door does not open properly yet. The new furniture does not actually help until the fundamental access problem gets fixed first. I am not saying never learn new words again. Obviously, your vocabulary should keep growing naturally over time, especially for topics specific to your work or interests. What I am saying is this: if speaking confidence in everyday conversation is your current priority, redirect the majority of your practice energy toward deeply, actively practicing your existing core vocabulary and patterns, rather than constantly chasing new words you may rarely even need in typical daily conversation. Depth of access, for the vocabulary you already have, will move your actual speaking confidence forward significantly faster than breadth of new vocabulary you have not yet learned to access quickly anyway. There is a useful visual I like to share here. Imagine two learners standing in front of two different closets. The first learner has an enormous closet, stuffed with hundreds of items of clothing, but everything is thrown in randomly, unsorted, hard to find in a hurry. The second learner has a much smaller closet, maybe a quarter of the size, but everything is neatly organized, easy to grab instantly, exactly matched to what they actually wear on a regular basis. If both learners need to get dressed quickly for an unexpected event, who finds a reasonable outfit faster? Almost certainly the second learner, despite owning far fewer items overall. Your core, frequently used vocabulary is that smaller, organized closet. Chasing rare, impressive words without first organizing and training access to your core vocabulary is like continuing to stuff more clothes into an already disorganized closet, technically increasing your total wardrobe, while doing nothing to solve the actual problem of finding something to wear quickly when it actually matters. Chapter 7. Building Retrieval Speed. Alright, let's get very practical now, because I promised you a real system, not just a shift in mindset. and this chapter is where we build the actual exercise that trains retrieval speed directly. The core method here is what I call speed rounds, and it is deceptively simple, but remarkably effective when practiced consistently. Here is exactly how it works. Choose a specific topic, let's say your weekend. Set a timer for 60 seconds. During that minute, speak continuously out loud in English about your weekend, describing anything and everything that comes to mind, without stopping, without worrying about perfect grammar, without pausing to search for a better word if a simpler one is available. The only rule is this: keep talking, out loud, the entire 60 seconds, even if what comes out feels simple, repetitive, or imperfect. The very first time you attempt a speed round, expect it to feel awkward, possibly even a little uncomfortable, especially if you have rarely, if ever, spoken continuously out loud to yourself before, alone, in a room, with a timer running. This discomfort is normal and temporary. Almost every learner reports that the second or third attempt already feels noticeably less strange than the first, simply through basic familiarity with the format itself. Do not judge the value of this exercise based on how strange that very first 60 seconds feels. Judge it based on how it feels after a week of consistent daily practice, which is a completely different experience for almost everyone who sticks with it. Why does this specific exercise work so well for training retrieval speed? Because the time pressure forces your brain to prioritize speed over perfection, which is exactly the skill real conversation actually demands. In a real conversation, nobody gives you unlimited time to construct the perfect sentence. The moment requires a reasonably good response, quickly, not a flawless response, eventually. Speed rounds directly simulate and train for that real-world condition, repeatedly, in a private, low-stakes setting where nothing bad happens if your sentences are not perfect. Here is how to build this into an ongoing practice. Start with one speed round a day, just 60 seconds, on any topic relevant to your life that day. As this starts feeling more comfortable, increase to 2 or 3 rounds, either extending the time slightly to 90 seconds or covering multiple different topics in one practice session. Occasionally, challenge yourself with topics you find slightly more difficult, expressing an opinion about something, describing a problem and a possible solution, explaining a process, rather than always sticking to easy, comfortable topics like your daily routine. A quick practical note on setting this up: you genuinely do not need any special app or tool to run these speed rounds. Any basic phone timer works perfectly well. Some learners find it helpful to record themselves during these sessions, using their phone's voice memo app, not necessarily to listen back every single time, but to have the option available occasionally, perhaps once a week, to compare an earlier recording against a more recent one. Hearing your own actual progress in your own voice tends to be far more convincing and motivating than simply trusting a vague, subjective feeling that things are improving. I also want to give you a slightly more advanced version of this exercise, once the basic version starts feeling manageable, called question speed rounds. Instead of choosing your own topic, write down 8 or 10 random questions in advance, on small pieces of paper or in a notes app. Things like, what is a skill you would like to learn? What is something that surprised you recently? What would you do with an unexpected free day? Then, without looking at the question until the exact moment you start, pick one randomly and speak about it immediately, for 30 to 60 seconds, no preparation time allowed. This version trains something even closer to real conversation, responding to genuinely unpredictable prompts under immediate time pressure, exactly the situation that trips up so many learners in real social and professional interactions. There is one more variation worth trying once you feel reasonably comfortable with the basic version, what I call the follow-up round. After finishing a 60-second response to a question or topic, immediately ask yourself a natural follow-up question, the kind a curious listener might genuinely ask next, and answer that too, for another 30 to 60 seconds, without any break in between. This trains a specific skill that isolated, single-topic speed rounds do not fully capture, the ability to sustain a conversation across multiple connected turns, rather than just producing one strong response and then running out of things to say, which is a very common experience even among learners who handle single questions reasonably well. I want to emphasize something about consistency with these speed rounds. that matters more than people often expect. A single, occasional speed round, done once in a while whenever you happen to remember, will produce very little noticeable change. The real value comes specifically from repetition, doing this small 60-second exercise regularly, ideally daily or close to it, because retrieval speed, like almost every other trainable skill, responds to frequency far more than to occasional intensity. A daily 60-second practice will, over a month, produce noticeably better results than one long 30-minute session done just once a week. Chapter 8. The Comfort Zone Trap. I want to address something honestly in this chapter, because I think it holds a huge number of learners back, without them even fully realizing it is happening. The comfort zone trap. Here is what this trap looks like in practice. A learner reaches a certain level, intermediate, maybe upper intermediate, where they can handle familiar topics reasonably well, ordering food, talking about their job in general terms, discussing the weather, basic small talk. Conversations within this familiar zone start to feel manageable, even comfortable. And so, understandably, the learner naturally gravitates towards staying within that same comfortable zone, repeating similar conversations, similar topics, similar vocabulary, again and again, month after month, sometimes year after year. The problem is, comfort and growth rarely coexist in the same space, in language learning or in almost any other skill. If every conversation you have stays within an already comfortable, already practiced zone, your speaking ability essentially plateaus at that comfortable level, because there is no new demand pushing your retrieval system to stretch, adapt, and grow beyond what already feels easy and automatic. I have noticed something interesting talking with learners who eventually break out of this particular trap. They often describe the same underlying realization, that staying comfortable actually felt safe in the short term but frustrating in the long term, while stepping slightly outside comfort felt uncomfortable in the short term but genuinely rewarding once they looked back weeks later. This trade-off, short-term comfort versus long-term growth, shows up constantly across almost every skill worth developing, and language speaking is really no exception to that general pattern. This explains a pattern many learners find genuinely confusing and discouraging, feeling stuck at the same speaking level for years, despite plenty of ongoing English exposure through shows, articles, and casual daily use. The exposure keeps happening, but if it consistently stays within an already comfortable zone, familiar topics, familiar vocabulary, familiar sentence patterns, it simply reinforces what is already automatic, rather than expanding the boundary of what is automatic into new, currently uncomfortable territory. The fix here requires deliberately, intentionally stepping slightly outside your current comfort zone on a regular basis, not constantly, not to the point of overwhelming frustration, but consistently enough to create real growth. This might mean choosing speed round topics that feel a little more challenging than your usual comfortable subjects, expressing a nuanced opinion instead of just describing a simple daily fact. It might mean practicing vocabulary and phrases for situations you have not yet needed but likely will soon, a difficult conversation at work, explaining a complex personal situation, discussing a topic you feel strongly about. It might mean seeking out conversation partners or content slightly above your current comfortable level, rather than always choosing the easiest, most familiar option available. None of this requires drastic, uncomfortable leaps all at once. Small, regular steps just past the edge of your current comfort, repeated consistently over weeks, accumulate into genuinely significant growth, far more reliably than occasional dramatic attempts at something far beyond your current level, which tend to feel overwhelming and are much harder to sustain as a regular habit. A useful way to think about this is the concept of a stretch zone, sitting just beyond your comfort zone, challenging enough to create real growth, but not so far beyond your current ability that it becomes overwhelming or discouraging. Comfort zone practice maintains your current level. Stretch zone practice, done consistently and repeatedly, is what actually expands it, and learning to deliberately seek out that stretch zone, rather than avoiding it, is one of the most important mindset shifts available to any learner who feels genuinely stuck at their current speaking level. Let me give you a concrete way to identify your own stretch zone, because the idea can feel a little abstract without a practical method attached to it. Think of 3 categories of topics. The first category is topics you could discuss right now, in English, with almost no hesitation, the genuinely comfortable zone. The second category is topics that feel completely overwhelming, where you would struggle even to begin, far beyond your current reach, at least for now. The third category, sitting right between those two, is topics that feel a little uncomfortable, a little effortful, but not impossible, where you could get through it with some hesitation and searching, but you could get through it. That third category, right in the middle, is your stretch zone, and it is exactly where your practice time produces the fastest, most noticeable growth. I also want to gently warn against a mistake I see fairly often. Learners who, once they discover this idea of the stretch zone, immediately push themselves into the second category, the genuinely overwhelming topics, believing that harder practice must automatically mean faster progress. This usually backfires, producing frustration, discouragement, and sometimes a retreat back into the comfort zone entirely, avoiding practice altogether for a while afterward. Real, sustainable growth happens specifically at the edge of manageable difficulty, not at the extreme edge of what currently feels impossible. Choose your stretch zone topics carefully, difficult enough to matter, manageable enough to actually complete. Chapter 9. Real Talk. What actually happens in conversation? Let's talk honestly about what real conversation actually looks like, because I think a lot of learners are quietly comparing themselves to an unrealistic, almost impossible standard without even realizing they are doing it. Many learners imagine that fluent speaking means producing long, grammatically perfect, beautifully structured sentences, smoothly, without any hesitation, filler words or restarts, every single time they speak. This image honestly does not match how real conversation actually works, even among native speakers in their own first language. Real conversation is messy. It includes false starts, sentences that change direction halfway through, filler words like and you know, repeated words, simplified grammar, and constant small imperfections that nobody consciously notices or judges, because the listener's attention is on meaning and connection, not on grading grammatical perfection like a strict exam. I want you to actually notice this the next time you watch an unscripted native English conversation, an interview, a casual discussion, anything genuinely spontaneous rather than scripted or rehearsed. Pay close attention, and you will hear restarts, filler words, incomplete sentences, and small grammar slips constantly, even from highly educated, articulate native speakers. This is not sloppy or bad English. This is simply what real, live, unscripted human speech actually sounds like, in every language, for every speaker, everywhere in the world. I want to share a specific example of the kind of thing I mean, without using any exact quotes, just describing the general pattern you will notice constantly once you start paying attention. A speaker might begin answering a question, pause mid-sentence, restart with a slightly different structure, insert a filler sound while thinking of the next word, and eventually arrive at a clear point, all within about 10 or 15 seconds. If you transcribed that exact same short answer word for word, it would likely look messy and disorganized on paper, full of repeated words and incomplete phrases. And yet, listening to it live, it sounds completely normal, even articulate, because human listeners process spoken language very differently from how they would judge the same content written down. This gap between how messy real speech looks in text and how normal it sounds out loud is worth remembering every time your own inner critic judges your spoken English against some imagined standard of written perfection. This pattern also holds true across different levels of formality in education. Even trained public speakers, news anchors, and experienced interviewers, people whose entire profession involves speaking clearly, still produce filler words, small restarts, and imperfect grammar regularly in unscripted moments. The truly polished, hesitation-free speech you might be comparing yourself to usually comes from scripted content, written in advance, rehearsed, and often edited afterward, not from genuine, spontaneous conversation. Comparing your live, unscripted speaking attempts to edited, scripted, or heavily rehearsed content is simply not a fair or accurate comparison, and letting go of that comparison is an important part of building realistic, sustainable speaking confidence. This matters enormously for your own speaking confidence, because it means the standard you have likely been silently holding yourself to, smooth, perfect, hesitation-free speech, is not even the standard native speakers hold themselves to in real conversation. Aiming for that impossible standard creates unnecessary pressure that actively makes speaking harder, because you are constantly, subconsciously monitoring for an unrealistic level of perfection that does not genuinely exist anywhere in natural human conversation. A much more useful, much more achievable standard is this: can I communicate my meaning clearly enough for the other person to understand and respond appropriately? That is the actual, real bar that real conversations are measured against, not grammatical perfection, not flawless vocabulary choice, not the complete absence of any hesitation or filler word. Once you consciously adopt this more realistic, more human standard, you will likely notice your speaking anxiety decreasing significantly, simply because you have replaced an impossible, artificial target with the actual, achievable target that real conversation genuinely requires. I want to give you a small, practical tool for internalizing this shift, something you can genuinely use before any conversation that feels intimidating. Right before speaking, silently repeat this phrase to yourself: connection over perfection. It sounds simple, maybe even a little too simple, but this small mental reframe, repeated consistently before speaking opportunities, gradually retrains where your attention goes during a conversation. Instead of a background process constantly scanning for grammar mistakes, your attention shifts toward the much more natural, much more human goal of actually connecting with the person in front of you, understanding them, being understood by them. Ironically, this shift in focus tends to improve your actual grammar and fluency as a side effect, because reduced anxiety generally allows smoother, faster access to language you already know, rather than the anxiety itself blocking that access. It also helps to actively collect evidence against the perfectionist standard, rather than just intellectually agreeing with the idea. The next time you watch any unscripted English content, deliberately count filler words, restarts, and small grammar slips from the native speaker, just for a minute or two. Most learners find this exercise genuinely eye-opening, discovering that even confident, articulate native speakers make far more of these small imperfections than they consciously noticed before. This kind of direct evidence tends to shift the perfectionist belief far more effectively than simply being told the idea once and moving on. Chapter 10. The Confidence Loop. I want to explain something in this chapter that I think is genuinely one of the most powerful and most overlooked mechanisms in building real speaking confidence, something I call the confidence loop. Here is how this loop works, in both its negative and positive versions, because understanding both directions really helps clarify exactly what we are trying to build. In the negative version of the loop, a learner feels anxious about speaking. That anxiety makes their actual speaking performance slightly worse, more hesitation, more freezing, more mistakes than they would otherwise make. That slightly worse performance then reinforces the original anxiety, confirming the fear that speaking is genuinely difficult and risky, which increases anxiety even further before the next speaking attempt. Round and round this loop goes, each cycle reinforcing and deepening the last, and this is exactly the cycle so many learners find themselves stuck inside, sometimes for years. The positive version of this exact same loop is what we are building throughout this entire video. A learner practices in a low-stakes, low-pressure setting, speed rounds, thinking in English, private practice with a patient partner. That practice, done repeatedly, gradually improves actual retrieval speed and comfort. That improved performance creates small, real, felt experiences of success. Noticing a sentence came out more smoothly than it used to. Noticing less hesitation on a topic that used to feel difficult. Those small successes then genuinely reduce anxiety for the next speaking attempt, because the brain has real evidence now that speaking generally goes reasonably well, rather than relying on an old, outdated fear based on past difficult experiences. Reduced anxiety then further improves the next performance, and the loop continues spiraling upward instead of downward. Here is the critical insight about this loop that I really want you to internalize. You cannot simply think your way into the positive version of this loop through motivation or positive self-talk alone, though those things can certainly help a little at the margins. The loop fundamentally requires real, repeated, actual practice experiences to generate the genuine felt sense of improvement that breaks the old negative pattern. This is exactly why every single practical exercise covered throughout this entire video, speed rounds, active recall, thinking in English, low-stakes practice conversations, exists specifically to feed this positive loop with real, concrete evidence of progress, rather than asking you to simply feel more confident through willpower alone, without any actual underlying skill development to genuinely justify that confidence. The encouraging news here is that this loop, in either direction, tends to accelerate once it gets moving, meaning the positive version genuinely does get easier and faster once it gains some initial momentum, which is not a coincidence. It is actually the entire reason this channel is named the Speaking Momentum in the first place. The first few weeks of consistent practice often feel like the hardest, slowest part of this whole process, before that positive loop really starts building noticeable, self-reinforcing speed. Let me describe what this shift often feels like in practice, based on patterns I have seen repeatedly among learners who commit to this kind of consistent, retrieval-focused practice. In the first week or two, progress can feel almost invisible, maybe even discouraging at times, the same hesitations, the same searching, seemingly little obvious change day to day. This is completely normal, and it is actually an expected part of how skill building works. Early neural changes happen well before they become consciously noticeable in performance. Then, often somewhere around the third or fourth week of consistent practice, learners frequently describe a specific, sometimes surprising moment, a sentence coming out smoothly without the usual hesitation, a word arriving instantly that used to take several seconds to find, a conversation that felt noticeably easier than similar conversations just weeks before. That moment is the positive confidence loop beginning to visibly, noticeably take hold, and once it starts, it tends to build on itself increasingly quickly, because each small success further fuels the next one. I want to be honest that this timeline varies from person to person, depending on starting level, consistency of practice, and individual factors that are hard to predict in advance. Some learners notice this shift earlier, some later. What matters far more than the exact timing is simply staying consistent through that initial, sometimes discouraging period where progress feels slow or invisible, because that period is not evidence that the method is not working, it is simply the normal, expected early phase of any skill genuinely being rebuilt at a deeper, more automatic level. Chapter 11. Daily practice that uses what you already have. Let's bring all of this together into a simple, sustainable daily practice you can genuinely maintain, because everything we have covered so far means very little without consistent, real application in your actual daily life. Here is a simple structure you can follow most days, adjusting the order and exact timing to fit your own schedule and energy. Start with a 2-minute active recall exercise, choosing a topic relevant to your day and speaking out loud, quickly, everything related to that topic that comes to mind from memory, without any references. Follow this with 1 or 2 speed rounds, 60 seconds each, speaking continuously about a chosen topic, or answering a random question you did not prepare in advance. Add a few minutes of thinking in English throughout your day, narrating simple daily activities or reactions silently or quietly out loud, using whatever vocabulary comes naturally, simplifying around any gaps rather than stopping to look things up immediately. Finish with a brief moment of stretch zone practice, deliberately choosing one topic or expression slightly more challenging than what already feels comfortable and easy. Notice that every single part of this structure centers on active, spoken retrieval of vocabulary and patterns you already largely possess, rather than the passive absorption of new material. This is intentional and important because this entire video has been built around one core message: your existing knowledge is very likely already sufficient for genuinely confident everyday conversation, and your daily practice time is best spent training access to that existing knowledge, not constantly expanding it further before the access problem has been properly addressed. I also want to mention something about realistic expectations for this daily practice, because I think honesty here genuinely serves you better than empty motivational promises. You will have some days where the words come out smoothly, and other days where everything feels sticky and slow, seemingly for no clear reason. This is completely normal, and it happens to every learner, at every level, including highly advanced speakers on an off day. Do not judge your progress based on any single day's practice session. Judge it based on the overall pattern across weeks and months, because that is genuinely where the real, measurable, meaningful progress becomes visible. Finally, keep some simple record of your practice, even something as basic as a check mark on a calendar for each day you completed some version of this routine, however small. This simple visual record becomes surprisingly motivating over time, and it also gives you something concrete to look back on during the inevitable moments of doubt, tangible, undeniable proof that you have genuinely been putting in consistent effort, even on days when your own internal feeling might tell you otherwise. I also want to address something practical about fitting this routine into an already busy life, because I know many of you watching this are juggling work, family, and countless other responsibilities, and the idea of adding one more daily task can feel genuinely overwhelming, even when the task itself is small. Here is something reassuring. The entire daily structure described in this chapter can realistically be completed in under 10 minutes, often closer to 5 or 6 minutes once you become familiar with the format. This is not a demanding, time-consuming program requiring hours of dedicated study each day. It is a small, focused, specific set of exercises designed precisely to fit into an already full life, because consistency over months matters far more for this kind of skill building than occasional, longer sessions that are hard to sustain alongside everything else you are managing. If even 10 minutes feels genuinely impossible on a particular day, remember what we discussed earlier about minimum viable practice. A single 60-second speed round, done even on your busiest, most exhausted day, keeps the habit alive and keeps that positive confidence loop gently turning, even when a full session simply is not realistic. Protecting the habit itself, even in its smallest possible form, matters more in the long run than any single day's exact duration or intensity. Chapter 12. Your 21-day activation plan. Let's close with a specific, structured plan you can start using literally today, right after this video ends, broken into 3 clear stages across 21 days. For days 1 through 7, your focus is entirely on establishing the core habit and building initial retrieval comfort. Each day, complete one active recall exercise on a topic from your daily life and one 60-second speed round, either on that same topic or a closely related one. Keep the topics comfortable and familiar during this first week. Your goal right now is simply building the habit and getting comfortable with the format itself, not yet pushing into more challenging territory. Add a few minutes of thinking in English scattered throughout your day, and notice, without judgment, how often you catch yourself defaulting to translation instead of direct English thought. For days 8 through 14, begin introducing question speed rounds and a small amount of deliberate stretch zone practice. Prepare 8 to 10 random questions in advance, and each day, without preparation, pick one and speak about it for 60 seconds. Start choosing at least one topic per day that feels slightly outside your usual comfort zone, expressing an opinion, describing a small challenge you are facing, explaining something slightly more complex than your basic daily routine. Continue your thinking in English practice and start extending it to cover slightly longer stretches of your day. During this second week, I also want you to introduce a simple weekly check-in with yourself, just a few minutes on day 14, reflecting honestly on what has felt easier compared to day 1 and what still feels genuinely difficult. Write down 2 or 3 specific observations. Perhaps a particular type of question still causes hesitation, or perhaps a specific topic now feels noticeably smoother than it did a week earlier. This kind of honest, specific self-reflection helps you notice real progress that might otherwise pass by unnoticed in the middle of a busy daily routine, and it also helps you identify exactly where to place extra focus during the final week of the plan. For days 15 through 21, shift toward integrating everything into something closer to real conversation. If at all possible, find some opportunity for real spoken interaction during this final week, a language exchange partner, an online conversation group, even a single patient friend willing to chat for 10 or 15 minutes in English. If real conversation genuinely is not available yet, continue your speed rounds, but chain multiple topics together into longer, more connected 2 to 3 minute sessions, practicing smooth transitions between ideas rather than isolated, disconnected responses. On day 21, record yourself speaking freely for 2 full minutes about anything at all, and compare that recording honestly to how you felt attempting the very first exercise on day 1. If real conversation practice is available to you during this final week, try to approach it with the same mindset we discussed earlier: connection over perfection, treating any hesitation or small mistake as simply part of the natural, expected process, not as evidence of failure. Notice, afterward, that a real conversation, even an imperfect one, likely felt more manageable than your anxious mind might have predicted beforehand, and file that experience away as genuine, concrete evidence for your positive confidence loop, evidence you can draw on the next time speaking anxiety tries to talk you out of a similar opportunity. I will be honest with you, 21 days will not transform you into a flawless, fully fluent speaker, and I would not trust any program that genuinely promised you that outcome in such a short window. But 21 days of consistent, correctly targeted retrieval practice will very likely produce a real, noticeable shift, less hesitation on familiar topics, faster access to words you already know, and a small but genuine increase in overall speaking confidence, the exact kind of early, tangible progress that fuels the positive confidence loop we discussed earlier and makes continuing the habit past day 21 feel far more natural and sustainable. I also want you to think of these 21 days as a starting structure, not a finish line where the work suddenly stops. Once you complete this initial period, simply continue the same core rhythm: active recall, speed rounds, thinking in English, stretch zone practice, gradually increasing difficulty and variety as your comfort grows. The specific topics and questions you use will naturally keep evolving to match your real life and real interests, but the underlying training principle remains exactly the same at every stage. Active, spoken retrieval practice, consistently applied, is what actually builds and maintains genuine speaking confidence, not passive accumulation of more material. Let me also address what to do if, partway through these 21 days, you feel like progress has stalled, or even feels worse on a particular day than it did a week earlier. This happens to nearly everyone, and it does not mean the method has stopped working. Skill development, in almost any domain, rarely follows a smooth, perfectly upward line. It tends to move in an uneven pattern, periods of noticeable improvement followed by brief plateaus, or even occasional days that feel like a step backward before the next period of improvement begins. If you hit one of these plateau days during your 21 days, the correct response is simply to continue the plan as written, trusting the process across the full arc of days, rather than making a snap judgment based on any single difficult session. One final note on this plan before we move to closing thoughts. Feel free to genuinely personalize the specific topics, questions, and stretch zone challenges you use throughout these 21 days to match your actual life, your actual work, your actual interests, and upcoming situations. The structure I have given you is a framework, not a rigid script, and the exercises will feel far more engaging and far more directly useful if the content inside that framework genuinely reflects things you care about and situations you will actually encounter, rather than generic, impersonal topics that have little real connection to your daily life. So here is what I want you to do, right now, before you close this video. Set a 60-second timer and speak out loud, continuously, about literally anything, your day so far, your plans for tonight, anything at all. That is it. That is your activation plan, officially started, right this moment. If this video helped you see your English in a genuinely new way, please subscribe, because this channel exists entirely to help you activate the English you already have, not just keep adding more that never quite gets used. I will see you in the next video, and until then, keep speaking, out loud, every single day, even when it feels imperfect, Consistent speaking is exactly how real momentum gets built. Before you go, I want to leave you with one final thought, because I think it matters more than anything else in this video. The English you need for the vast majority of your daily conversations is very likely already sitting inside you, right now, in this moment, fully available, waiting to be trained into fast, confident access, rather than remaining locked behind years of untrained retrieval and understandable anxiety. You did not fail by struggling to speak up until now. You simply were never shown that speaking and knowing are two separate skills requiring two separate kinds of practice. Now you know, and knowing that alone changes everything about how you approach your practice from this point forward. Somewhere down the road, whether it takes 3 weeks, 3 months, or longer, there will come a moment where a conversation that once felt terrifying suddenly feels almost easy, where a word that used to freeze you comes out without a second thought, where you catch yourself mid-conversation and realize you have simply been speaking, naturally, without the constant internal struggle that used to accompany every sentence. That moment is not luck, and it is not reserved for people with some special natural gift for languages. It is simply what consistent, correctly targeted practice produces over time for absolutely anyone willing to show up and do the work, a little each day, starting from wherever you are standing right now.